What rank did you achieve as a member of the United States Army?
Well, I entered as a second lieutenant out of ROTC at the University of Connecticut, and I was a captain when I left active duty.
So, what made you want to join the military?
Well, that's an interesting question. Couple of things, really. It's what the men in my family did. My father was an ROTC graduate in World War II. My uncle was an OCS officer in the Marine Corps in World War II. He was killed in the Pacific on Peleliu. And in 1961, that was a requirement of men at UConn that we all engage in military training, ROTC training, for at least 2 years. So the first 2 years was not an option. Then you had to make a decision as to whether you wanted to go for the second 2 years, and I did. And interesting, it turned out that I don't know what the glitch was, but there was a glitch. And in my senior year, I was called in. I assumed like everybody else. And I was called in and said, well, there's been a glitch. You have to make a decision again whether you want to stay in. And it's interesting, this time, at this time, I'd been married. I was probably married for a month or maybe 2. And I didn't dare have this discussion with my wife because I was afraid her vote would be, let's get out. So I didn't ask her. I'm no longer married to her, so I don't have to worry about getting overruled now. So anyway, I decided to, volunteer again.
So, did you have any choice in the matter into what role you played as an officer in the United States Army? What position, what occupation you perform?
I did, as a matter of fact. I'm positively one of the luckiest Army officers of my era, bar none. I had choice of branch because I had been what they called in those days a distinguished military graduate, which is kind of funny because my undergraduate record was far from distinguished. But I did pretty well in the ROTC courses, so they offered me a regular Army commission, which I declined because, again, what men in my family did was we didn't make a profession of the Army. We were citizen soldiers. We were ROTC guys. So I said, no, I'd stay with the Reserve Commission. But I got a choice of branch. So I chose the Army Intelligence branch. So in answer to your question, I had a very, very close association with picking what I was going to do in the Army, or at least so I thought. As it turned out, second lieutenant intelligence types are attached to infantry units. I wasn't real high on going into the infantry. That didn't seem to me like a very glamorous, part of the Army, but that was my first Army school. I went to the Infantry Officers Basic Course at Fort Benning in Georgia for 8 hot, steamy weeks in the summer of 1965. That was my introduction to the Army, was in the infantry.
So apart from that basic training school, did you attend any other military schools?
Yes. After finishing in Georgia, I went to the Intelligence Officers School in Baltimore, Maryland. I thought it was the garden spot of the East Coast after having spent the summer in Georgia. And it was interesting. It was fun. It was a short school. And then I was assigned to an intelligence unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, just down the road from Baltimore.
What intelligence topics were taught at Baltimore?
Well, my MOS was military POW interrogator. So we were taught interrogation techniques. I never did get to interrogate anybody, but there were courses on intelligence analysis. There were courses on security, interestingly enough. how to secure a base, a structure, a building, something as sophisticated as chain link and barbed wire fencing, and locks, padlocks, how to defeat them, bolt cutters mainly.
Secret agent material.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that too. The next course, there would have been more of that. I'm not sure they knew, what they wanted military second lieutenants to do, whether they wanted us to be, CIA spooks or military spooks. And it finally got resolved that no, we weren't going to be CIA types. We were going to be, military types assigned to military units.
Did the CIA recruit from military intelligence?
Yes, they did. They never recruited me, but I know people that that did go on to careers with the CIA.
So describe a normal day of duties at Fort Meade.
Fort Meade was a country club. It would have been the best assignment in the world in a peacetime army. Halfway between Baltimore and Washington. It was the home then, as now, of the National Security Agency, NSA, real high-tech intelligence gathering, mostly electronic eavesdropping. My unit didn't really do very much. We were what we would even, acknowledge to one another. We were a replacement company, someplace to put people until they could be assigned to units in Korea or Vietnam. And that's really all. We were just marking time, holding our place there. We did training. We did marksmanship training. We trained on, on the M14, which was not our basic weapon, but we trained on it anyway. The Army M1911-45, which was our basic weapon. I can remember one very cold day on the 45 range. All we wanted to do was shoot up enough ammunition so we could go in and get warm. We studied chemical warfare survival techniques, I recall. We had a language lab where people with language capability would go, and listen to tapes that would keep their language capability up if they had a language capability, and then just wait for assignment to either Korea or Vietnam.
So were you and most of your classmates, most of your fellow officers, fairly sure that your assignment would be one or the other of those locations?
Almost assuredly, yes.
So what was your eventual duty assignment?
Honolulu, Hawaii.
And how did you arrange that deal?
Well, being as close to Washington as we were, that's where the Army was headquartered, and that's where our branch was headquartered. Our military intelligence had its headquarters in Washington D.C. And there was always this discussion: did you raise your head up and say, "Hey, look at me," or did you keep your head down and say, "Don't look at me"? Well, I decided that as long as I was that close, I would go visit the branch assignments officer and ask what he had in mind for me. The guy's name was Fox, Major Fox, the notorious Major Fox in 1965.
Why was he?
Or was this 66? Must have been 66.
Where did his notoriety arrive from?
His ability to send you anywhere in the world. He was the guy that decided where you went. He had the power. So I went and talked to him, and I talked to him twice, actually. And the second time, when he came back into his office, I was waiting in his office, and it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he announced that he had just finished with the dentist. And he didn't have to go back to the dentist for a very long time. And I thought to myself, I know how good I feel when I finish with the dentist. So I assumed that Major Fox was in a very good and expansive mood that afternoon. And early in the discussion, he looked at me and he said, "Where would you like to go? Anywhere in the world." And I thought quickly, and I said, Germany. I'd love to go to Germany. He said, sorry, Germany is full. How about Honolulu? I said, I'll take it.
So at that time, the war, or even in the state of 1960s politics, would a young officer be fearful of a Germany assignment, considering the state of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union?
No, there was no fear that Germany was a risky assignment. What we were doing, what intelligence officers were doing in Germany, was interrogating line crossers. So I mean, I could have used my interrogation skills, but I didn't speak German. I didn't speak Russian. I'm not quite sure what I would have done if I'd actually gone to Germany. No, Germany wasn't considered a risky assignment. Everybody knew Vietnam was a risky assignment. People were getting shot at, in Vietnam. Korea was considered a hardship assignment, although not necessarily risky. I mean, it certainly would have been risky if the North Koreans had decided to cross the line again, but nobody gave that a tremendous amount of thought. We were then, as now, a tripwire force, and the force would have been overrun if you'd have gone to Korea. It was just a hardship post, unaccompanied tours, no dependents accompanied there, boring, cold, drab.
Quite the contrast to Hawaii.
Quite the contrast to Hawaii, and even Vietnam. Vietnam was hot and exciting, a shooting war. But Korea was just considered dull. But yeah, Honolulu was considered anything but, boring or dull. It was considered a plum.
So where are you stationed in Honolulu? What was the name of the base?
I was stationed at Fort Shafter, which was the headquarters of the United States Army Pacific Command. And I was on the G2 staff of the United States Army Pacific Command. That's the intelligence staff.
So what were some of your responsibilities as a member of this G2 staff?
My main responsibility was I was in the materiel and resources division of, I was assigned to a military intelligence battalion, the 319th Military Intelligence Battalion detached. I'm not quite sure what we were formally attached to or subsequently detached from, but we were the 319th Military Intelligence Battalion detached. And there were different desks. It was set up in area desks. The Korea desk, the Thai desk, the Vietnam desk, which had a lot of people assigned to that. I wasn't assigned to a company desk. I was assigned to the materiel and resources desk, which was looking at basically or mostly equipment that was coming into North Vietnam from China, into North Vietnam from the Soviet Union by ship, and then it being infiltrated, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. That's what most of my work, entailed. I was lucky enough, absolutely lucky enough, to actually make friends with a guy who was a very old captain. I'm not sure whether I was a captain by that time or not. I don't think so. I think I was still a lieutenant when I met this guy. Really nice guy. And nobody could quite figure out why he was such an old captain. But those things are, vague and among the regular Army guys. Anyway, it turned out he'd been passed over twice by mistake. By mistake. So one day he came to work a captain. Next day he came to work a lieutenant colonel. He jumped right through major, right to lieutenant colonel. And he remembered who his friends were. So he gave me a job with him. He was given the job of the USARPAC, which is the acronym for the U.S. Army Pacific, the USARPAC watch officer. And he made me his assistant watch officer. And what the watch officer did, and what the assistant watch officer did, was go around to the various other country desks and say, or ask, what's going to happen in the next 30 days? Not strategic stuff. What's going to happen, quickly? What should we know about quickly? What should we keep a watch on? And then make a better story if I could remember whether it was weekly. I don't think it was weekly. It may have been bi-weekly. We would meet other watch officers from the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and we would meet at the joint headquarters of the Pacific, which was the Marine base, Camp Smith was the Marine base, which is where this joint watch committee would meet. And boy, that was a fascinating meeting.
How many personnel were usually at these meetings?
Maybe 20 to 25, maybe 30 if you considered all the assistants.
So how many people would normally be manning the desks at USRPAC?
Oh, hundreds. Well, a couple of hundred, not 1,000, a couple of hundred. But the interesting part of the watch committee was I asked my boss one day, I said, who are those guys? He said, I can't tell you. He said, you don't have a need to know who they are.
And I told you exactly who they were.
Sort of. I mean, we knew that the CIA was probably there. We knew that the State Department was probably there. But that still didn't account for everybody at the table. So no, I don't know who some of those people were. And he wouldn't tell me. He wasn't enough of a jokester to say, well, then I'd have to kill you. But he just said, no, you don't need to know who they are. To this day, I don't know who they were.
So when you talk about these watch assignments, what will happen in the next 30 days? What was it like being in those offices during large-scale events like the Tet Offensive?
The Tet Offensive was unique, to my experience there. It was toward the end of my experience there. It was literally a one-time event, and everybody had their eyes on just that. And we didn't. The watch committee didn't have operational responsibility for Vietnam. So Vietnam was off the table. That was MACV's responsibility.
Military Advisory Command.
Yeah. What's that? Military Advisory Command Vietnam. MACV. MACV would tell the guys at USAPAC headquarters what they thought they ought to know. At that level, everybody was interested in Vietnam. Needless to say, there was an awful lot of stuff on Vietnam, but mostly the things that we did in Hawaii were strategic studies, like this material and resources coming in and going. It wasn't operational stuff. The operational stuff was all going on at MACV. What the watch committee would take is we'd take information from the Korea desk, from the China desk. What's going on the border here, guys? Anybody moving around? Anybody, getting together? Any massing of units? Everybody was alert to either North Korea, invading South Korea again. You have to remember, this is not a dozen years after the Korean War. It's within that. I have to be a little careful about exactly how long. But it wasn't that long that the Korean War experience was on everybody's mind, and the G2 that I worked for was a colonel. I can't remember his name. Maybe it's just as well, because he was one of the longer serving colonels in the Army. He was made a brigadier general while I was there, and then transferred to Vietnam. But he was General MacArthur's G2 in Korea, and told General MacArthur that the Chinese would not enter the war. And everybody in the Army saw what happened to him in his career, and basically saw what happened to General MacArthur's army, acting on that advice that no, the Chinese would not enter the war. So we were very alert to, were the Chinese going to enter either the Korean Peninsula or the war in Vietnam. That was a big deal on everybody's mind.
So what types of material would they be sending in by rail?
Virtually everything. Trucks, weapons, anti-aircraft guns. The SAM missiles mostly came by ship.
Would those be from the USSR?
From the USSR, yep. Food.
Now, as an interrogator, as an intelligence officer, did you ever hear reports of any Chinese advisors being captured by United States forces?
No, I never heard of any being captured. We heard that there might be some. And we were always looking for Chinese markings, on weapons. And to the best of my recollection, there were very, very few. Very few. So few that we couldn't really make head or tail out of it. They just didn't seem to be supplying, the kinds of weapons that would get down into South Vietnam. The Russians did, AK-47s and anti-aircraft, weapons and what have you.
So is any of that material domestically produced in North Vietnam?
I don't think so. I think most of their weapons were supplied by the Russians and some by the Chinese. The aircraft were all Russian aircraft.
So the aircraft, the anti-aircraft, food, small arms,
Mm-hmm.
everything would be contributed by adjacent or friendly communist countries?
Yep. Mostly Chinese and Russian. I'm trying to think whether there was any North Korean aid. I don't remember that there was.
So,
Eastern European countries too. Czechoslovakian arms. Polish maybe. Czechoslovakian for sure.
So besides the Tet Offensive and the 30-day watches, do you recall any other points of intense focus for your staff on the Vietnam War?
Actually, it was not Vietnam War related. It was the capture of the intelligence vessel. Who captured the vessel, and what was the vessel's name?
Do you remember the nationality of the vessel?
Oh, it was ours, one of ours. It was one of our intelligence gathering ships that either became disabled or disoriented or captured. Oh, cripes. What was the name of that boat? Ship, not a boat. Probably come to me after you drive up the driveway. They captured the crew.
This is the Vietnamese or the Chinese?
Vietnamese, I think. The interesting, one of the interesting things, needless to say, that provoked a lot of activity, for the week. What are we going to do? How are we going to get them back? How are we going to keep them from, taking these guys? And it was a whole crew of a small ship, but the crew of the ship, taking them into the country, into the interior, so that we couldn't get them back. Oh, that was a 24/7 deal for the better part of a week. And I'm embarrassed I can't think of the name of that ship. The Pueblo was captured.
So what was the culmination of these events?
The crew was returned, and it was one kind of interesting anecdote was the crew was photographed, by their captors, and they were all giving the photographer the finger, the middle finger raised salute, And they told the photographer this was the Hawaiian good luck sign.
Sailors will be sailors.
Sailors will be sailors. And it was a way to tell people that, that they were okay, they were resisting to the degree that they could. We took that as a good sign, that their morale was where it ought to be. Give those guys the finger.
Good luck. But
Yep.
So the capture of the Pueblo, the Tet Offensive. Besides these focal points of political controversy and military campaign, what were some more of the day-to-day experiences? Events that you'd encounter, events that you'd anticipate? What would be the norm for your intelligence operations?
Well, I hate to say it was not boring in the least. It was a fascinating job. It really was. But it wasn't exciting. It wasn't something that, that you'd go and say, well, this was an exciting day today. It was like going to work. I lived with my wife. I had 2 children at the time. We lived on the grounds of the Tripler Army Medical Center, which is the big joint military hospital in Honolulu. And I'd get up in the morning. I'd have breakfast with my wife. I'd get in my car and I'd drive to work. Sometimes it was an early morning. One of the other jobs I had was to prepare the morning briefing. This is not all at the same time, but I'm trying to think sequentially when I had this job. But I had to go to work and prepare the briefing for the general staff at 7 o'clock. So I'd get there about 4:30, go over the traffic that had come in, over the previous evening, decide what would go into the 7 o'clock briefing, and prepare the briefing book. That was fairly interesting. That was very interesting. And I'd be done by 7 o'clock. So I didn't have a heck of a lot, to do. So I would go, I'd go to breakfast. And then a couple of guys, that I worked with, and I would go swimming. And we'd come back after lunch and, read the traffic that came in that morning, leave about 4:30, and come in at 4 o'clock the next morning.
So when you were reviewing the traffic, were you looking at aviation or satellite imagery, or were you reading reports taken from the area?
I was reading reports. The photo intelligence was done in an entirely different shop from ours, with a different classification. I had a very high classification, but my classification did not include photo or satellite imagery.
So at the time, how are these images, or how are these reports transmitted to Hawaii from South
We call them telex.
Telex.
Precisely what that entails, I'm not sure, but they were just printed on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and they were identified as to where they came from, who originated them, what the subject matter was. One morning, there were a stack of messages labeled critic, except that critics were never critical. I'd leave the critics to last. As odd as that sounds, I'd read the other stuff, and I'd get to the critics, basically after I put the briefing together, because they were never critical, never.
What kind of material have you mentioned in a critical telex?
Oh, I'm trying to think. Aircraft movement, as I recall. Dull to me. So I left the stack of critics on my desk, and I went to the bathroom. And I was in the bathroom, and all of a sudden there's this enormous explosion. And I thought, oh my God, it's happening again. One of those critics said, "Imminent attack on Pearl Harbor," and I missed it. That flashed through my mind in the bathroom. No, it was just the cannon going off for reveille at Fort Shafter, but I never put the critics off to one side after that.
Flashbacks to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, shades of Honolulu.
So, during all these events with the intelligence staff, while you were constantly focused on Vietnam, did you feel that the U.S. Army and the United States was in a state of war based on your conditions on base? What was the quality of life?
In Honolulu? Well, it was very good. It was, nobody shot at me ever. In the 3 years and 1 day that I was in the Army, the only time I ever, had live ammunition over my head was, in a controlled training situation.
So you wouldn't carry sidearms?
No, we were never armed, never. It was interesting, though. What struck me at the time, and would today, if I were to go back to Hawaii, is that it's all of the military services are there. The naval base at Pearl Harbor is one of the most impressive, military installations I've ever seen. And I would, where we went to buy groceries at the commissary was on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, and I'd take a detour by Battleship Row just to see it. And occasionally I'd take a detour by the sub pens, at Pearl, just to see it. It was so impressive. And the Air Force Base at Hickam, which was immediately adjacent to Honolulu International, was likewise impressive. If you on the way to this one particular area, we would go by where they would park the U-2 spy planes, and seeing two of them parked by the end of the runway, that was impressive to me.
Were those closely guarded at the time?
No, they weren't. Nope, they were. There were no revetments around them. There was no real threat. There was no physical threat in Hawaii. There were no bombings, no sabotage, nothing of that kind. But again, the thing that struck me as impressive militarily was just the huge military footprint on that island of Oahu. Bases everywhere. All the services represented, and represented in force. There was no question, no ifs, no ands, no buts, that there was a war effort going on, and that even those of us far to the rear of the fighting war in Vietnam, we were busy, and it was kind of on a war footing without being 24/7, because we would get Saturday afternoon off and Sunday off. I'd go to the beach with my family on Sundays. My favorite beach was out on the North Shore, Waimea Bay, and one of the things that I liked about it was there was a sign as you drove into Waimea Bay: "This beach off limits to all military personnel." So I thought I was being mildly rebellious just going to the beach on Sunday afternoon. What it really meant was, if you drowned there, you dummy, you didn't get any benefits. That's really all that sign meant. The MPs were not going to come along and drag me off in chains.
So during all this time, really, what was your engagement and what was your mindset towards the politics of the war? Because just as militarily intense as the war was, did you really get any of the same public reaction in Hawaii as you would say returning GIs would get on the continent?
No. I think that's a perceptive question too. No. Because of the big military footprint, because There was such a strong military contingency there. There was very, very little. I can't remember any active dissent. We were aware of dissent. We were aware of the Kent State situation. We were aware of marches on Washington and such, but it really didn't reach Hawaii. There was a little humor around whether President Johnson would run again. He flew over Tripler Army Hospital in a helicopter, and my wife leaned out the window and said, "We applaud your decision not to run." But not much by way of politics in terms of opposition to the war. Very, very little. I personally thought the war was appropriate to be fought then and now. Probably not surprising then. Then and now, I believe the domino theory to have been correct, sound, and appropriate. It was a war, in my opinion, that needed to be fought not for the territory of Vietnam, but in shorthand to keep the Chinese home, to keep the Chinese where they were so they would not expand, they being the Chinese, would not expand into Southeast Asia, Thailand, Burma, Singapore, and then down into Indonesia. And if they were to go in that direction, the thought was that the North Koreans probably would not stay home. If the Chinese didn't stay home, the North Koreans probably wouldn't have stayed home. So in my opinion then, still my opinion today, that the Vietnam War was designed to keep the Chinese and the North Koreans where they were and not let them expand into Southeast Asia or the Pacific Rim.
So would you describe the war as a holding action?
Yep, I've used that term, and when I think of it that way, I think part of the problem of Vietnam was it was close enough to World War II, which was a huge victory, and when all of the sacrifice was justified in terms of we've got to take Berlin or we've got to take Tokyo, and that's what the sacrifice was designed for. Well, in Vietnam, we didn't want to take Hanoi. We didn't want to take Peking, it was called in those days. We didn't want to take that territory. How do you say to a mother, a father, a wife, we want your son to die in a holding action? An awful lot of war is a holding action, but it's very difficult, to trump up a lot of enthusiasm for it by labeling it as such.
No one can imagine.
And I think our sacrifice was rewarded. If you look around the Pacific today, you'll see the kind of a society that the Vietnam War was designed to enable, not necessarily produce, but was designed to enable, so that the Thais could develop their society, so that the Indonesians could develop their society, so that the South Koreans could build really nice cars, and the Japanese could continue being the Japanese happily. And I think we succeeded. I don't think it would have happened. It's one of those things, it's hard to prove the negative, but I don't think it would have happened without our presence in Vietnam.
So to that extent, the fact that the United States showed such an investment in the defense of South Vietnam, suspended the dominoes and prevented them from falling into Southeast Asia.
That's my strongly held belief.
And
I think the facts on the ground bear me out.
Right. Well, the world has seen the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yep.
And the international marketing of the People's Republic of China.
Yep. What I think I don't hear any discussion of today, and there's a real good reason, for why not, was the great leap forward, in China. Again, I'm not precise on the dates, but the late 50s, early 60s, Mao Zedong sent all the, professors and intelligentsia to the countryside, was going to move the country forward, and this great leap was a great upheaval. And he wanted to export this. There was no secrecy that he wanted to export his brand of communism from China, as far as he could. And the Chinese, again, then as now, had the numbers. They always had the numbers. There's no way you can deny, a billion Chinese are a factor to be reckoned with, then as now. But then very differently. They were expansionists, they were volatile, they were violent and dangerous. And I believe our actions in Vietnam were designed, to keep that activity home in China and not let it expand into the rest of Asia. And it worked.
So for US APAC, was there a desk devoted to China as well as Southeast Asia?
Oh yes, absolutely. China got a lot of resources, more than any other single desk, with the exception of Vietnam.
So what type of activity would be observed at the Chinese desk?
Military troop movements, military unit movements, was what I saw. And I was never on that desk, but one of my better friends was. So I would visit with him from time to time and ask him what he was doing. And he'd show me where people were and where they were going and where they'd come from and what have you. There may have been somebody studying the politics of China too, but that was not in our shop. Some of those guys at the watch table were probably studying the politics in China, but not in our shop.
So the primary focus of your specific team was military movement.
Yes.
And material.
Yep.
Now, during the war, how many Chinese troop movements, how many Chinese divisions were located in the vicinity of North Vietnam?
I don't know. I really don't know. There were, as I recall the map, there were more Chinese troop units along the North Korea border and along the Soviet border. That there was no real concentration along the Vietnam border. In other words, we weren't nervous that they were going to come imminently, across the Vietnam border.
As they had in Korea?
As they had in Korea, that's right. The reason we didn't bomb Haiphong or mine Haiphong early, and the reason we didn't bomb the railroads in any proximity to the Chinese border was we didn't want to provoke them, into moving troops up and then, coming across the border. Best of my recollection, there were no mass Chinese troops on the Vietnam border. There were masses along the Soviet border and along the North Korean border, though.
So ideologically, were you ever in opposition to military policy in Southeast Asia?
No.
While you were in the service?
No. I was always fully supportive of what we were doing in Vietnam. When I got to Boston University Law School after I left the military.
And what year would this be?
1968. I went in 1968. 1968 to 1971 in law school. There was a guy in the library circulating a petition to remove troops from Vietnam. And I said to him, well, no, I won't sign that petition. I said, but if you have a petition, asking for the 1st Infantry Division to go into Cambodia and eliminate the sanctuaries, I'll sign that petition. Oh, he thought I was a, he thought I was a warmongering something or other, muttered and left.
So, as a U.S. Army veteran in the city of Boston in 1968, did you ever receive any negative public reaction?
No, no. Um, I mean, I was out of the Army at that point, and the only time I wore my uniform was on the flight from California to Boston. I wore my uniform. That was the last time. So I mean, they didn't have very much opportunity to give me any kind of a hard time welcome or a warm welcome. No, I didn't. And I didn't. I understood the protest that was going on. I mean, I could see it. I could hear it. Many of the people I was in school with, were against the war, and my take on it then, it still is that their opposition to the war was less political than personal. They didn't want to go. They didn't see it as something valuable to them for this holding action in a small country of Vietnam that they couldn't see having any importance to them.
So, at what point in the war did the United States eliminate the college deferment system?
I don't remember. It was after me. Frankly, I think when I said I was one of the luckier ones, around, it's true from the assignments that I got. I'll tell you in a minute how I got out early, but I don't think I would be practicing law today if it hadn't been for my Army service. Several reasons. One is I wouldn't have been accepted. My undergraduate record was less than stellar. When I was in the Army, I learned to study, which I didn't learn as an undergraduate. I learned to sit down at a desk and concentrate for hours at a time, which I never learned to do as an undergraduate. So when I took the law boards, I did very well on the law boards. And furthermore, the schools, and I know this for a fact at BU. I can't say this for all, professional schools, but I know BU would normally take a class of 300. In 1968, they took 400. Had they taken only 300, I don't think I would have been in that 300. But I was in the 400 because my military service was over, and they knew that if they could keep me in school, I'd pay my bills because I got the GI Bill. And we fooled them. The veterans fooled them. We did far better than our undergraduate records would indicate because we were older and more focused. And in my case, anyway, I can't speak for everybody else, but in my case, I literally had learned how to work, how to study. And I was invited to join the law review at the end of my first year. I didn't know what law review was. I didn't know you should want to be on law review. I just didn't know. But it was, the top 10% of the class were invited to join the law review. I didn't have any clue that I was going to be in the top 10% of the class. But that's because of my Army training.
So, when it comes to law school, was that an interest before your military service? Or was it something about your service that made you want to go into that particular profession?
No, law school was something I wanted to do, but wasn't sure I'd be able to do until the Army. until during that period of time, I took a couple of practice tests. I took the Foreign Service test. I took the law boards for practice 1 year. And I studied for those tests. You're not supposed to be able to study, but the way I studied for those tests was I read Oxford histories, and it was very, very good preparation, for those tests. And I got the feeling I could probably do this law business, and it was really what I was good at. Part of my undergraduate record that wasn't very good were the sciences. At one point when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. That was a childish, thing that took me a long time to be disabused of. And I didn't do very well in zoology, and I didn't do very well in chemistry, and I didn't do very well in the sciences. And it finally got through my head, you do well in the political science classes, the history classes, the English classes. Why don't you play to your strength instead of your weaknesses? So I did. Anyway, the Army, my second, 2 years in college and the Army literally did prepare me for law school.
That's fantastic.
Lucky me again.
Hey, there we go. So,
I'll tell you how I got out of the Army. Talk about lucky.
3 years and 1 day.
3 years and 1 day. Well, as an ROTC lieutenant, I had a 2-year obligation. ROTC officers get out after 2 years. We're OBV2s, but we have an end date. It's like an enlistment, but you're an officer. You can get out after 2 years. To get this Honolulu assignment, I had to extend. Well, I was naive. I didn't quite understand what this extension meant, but I knew I was going to, go to Hawaii, and my wife and 2 kids were going to be able to. I had 1 child at the time. We were going to be able to come along. So I thought that was a good deal. It was a bad deal. It was a bad bargain. But as luck would have it, I read 1 issue of the Army Times newspaper in my entire Army career. On one of those mornings when I had finished the 7 o'clock briefing and I had nothing else to read, I read the Army Times. And on the front page, below the fold, there was an article that said, extended personnel can be released early from their obligation if they meet these 6 criteria. I looked at them and I said, I meet that one, that one, that one. 5 of the 6.
Do you recall the criteria?
No. No. But I didn't meet the 6th. The 6th was that you'd completed your obligation to the tour you were on. Not quite exactly sure how you did that. It's a lot about the Army that's mild, cloaked in some bureaucratic mystery. But I could see I met 5 of those 6. So I went to the personnel office and I said to the guy who was sitting there, let's submit this application. He goes, he says, I'm sorry, Lieutenant, you don't meet all 6 criteria. I said, well, 5 out of 6 isn't bad. Let's give it a try. Okay, fine. So he submits it. We get, response back. No, this individual will not be released at this time. He has not met all 6 criteria. But he will be released on June 8th, 1968. And from that day on, people all around me were going to Vietnam, going to Korea. I didn't go anywhere. I got my orders to get out on June 8th, 1968.
3 years and 1 day.
3 years and 1 day.
So what was your living situation like on Honolulu? Did you live in a barracks?
No, I lived in an apartment with my wife and 2 kids. And we had a view that nobody could afford to buy today, or then. As we looked out our backyard, we could see from Diamond Head on the left to beyond Pearl Harbor on the right, and downtown Honolulu in the middle. couldn't buy that view. There were like maybe 16 or 18 units. It was basically for nurses. These units were for nurses at Tripler. So they weren't fancy. They were what they call company grade, housing. They weren't fancy. They were somewhat Spartan, but still nice. I mean, we had a kitchen, we had a living room, dining room. We had 3 small bedrooms. In fact, it was very nice. And that no barracks for me. Eat at home every night. The other families that lived on that same little cul-de-sac, were delightful people. We got to know some really nice friends. We would party with them. We had a New Year's Eve party one New Year's Eve. We got out on the lawn. We all pooled our food and our liquor, and everybody bought a bottle of champagne. There was a guy home from Vietnam. He bought a bottle of French champagne, which we saved for last. That was a mistake because it had gone bad. By the time we opened it, it was vinegar, and we drunk all the other champagne by that time. But we could see the fireworks, in downtown Honolulu. We could hear all of the celebrations on New Year's Eve. What would that have been? That would have been New Year's 1968.
Was that right before Tet?
Yep, it was right before Tet. So the living was quite nice.
Oh, I can imagine. And definitely atypical.
Definitely
Army
atypical.
Experience.
Definitely atypical.
As with the rest of your service.
Yep.
So, coming back to your duty assignments in Hawaii. So there's the Pueblo incident, the Tet incident, and do any other startling situations come to mind? Was there any fear of the Soviet Union entering the Pacific?
No.
That would have been more naval intelligence?
Might have. I shouldn't say no. We were concerned, and again, the reason Haiphong was not bombed was the ships in Haiphong were Russian and Eastern European ships. So we didn't want to blow up, any Russian ship or who else had ships? No blowing up communist shipping, killing, communist seamen, giving the Russians any pretense at all, for joining. Although, frankly, I don't recall that we considered that a real high threat, not anywhere near to the degree that, we were worried about the Chinese and the North Koreans. But it was a possibility, and we didn't want to, kill any Russian seamen.
Have you ever gone back to return? Have you ever returned to Honolulu?
Yes. Yep, I have. My daughter was born there. She was born at Tripler. And so she considers herself a Wahine, native-born Hawaiian. And I came home from school one day, and I'd seen the American Bar Association Journal. This was probably, 72 or 73. And they had published all of the list of places that they were going to hold their conventions for the next 10 years. And the convention, the ABA convention in 1980 was going to be in Honolulu. So I announced at dinner that night that I thought it would be a good idea if the family would go back, to Honolulu for the ABA convention in 1980. Oh, everybody thought that was a great idea. Tremendous idea. And over the succeeding years, periodically my daughter would go, "Dad, are we still going to Hawaii in 1980? And I'd go, "Yes, dear, we will. Yes, of course, hon." She must ask that numerous times. Well, 1980 dawns. The tone of voice changes. Now it's, "Dad, it's 1980. we're going, right? Well, 1980 was a bad economic year. But again, through a stroke of luck, I had somebody repay money that I'd lent them years ago and allowed me to take money I probably should not have spent, on a trip to Hawaii. But my kids and I went back. Saw where we lived, saw the hospital, where she was born, saw Waikiki, the military beach at Waikiki. We had a wonderful, wonderful visit. Our housing had gone downhill and deteriorated a little bit. Kids were not enthused, like, we live there? I said, yeah, and we were happy to get it too. But that was the last time I was back.
Do you participate in any veterans reunions?
No.
Are you a member of any veterans associations?
No.
So
I always considered myself a citizen soldier and not a regular soldier. When I got out, I got out. I actually gave some thought to staying in the reserves. I knew people that had done that, that would go on their reserve duty. They'd go to the Pentagon one summer, and then they'd go to Hawaii, on alternate summers. I thought that sounded pretty nifty. But when I proposed it, the woman I was married to at the time thought that was the worst idea she'd ever heard, short of moving back to Honolulu to live. She didn't like that one either. But it made her very nervous, to be a dependent, have no control over your destiny, and she just did. She found it very hard. You could get orders tomorrow, to go to Vietnam or Korea or wherever. And she said, you're out now, and if you want to go back in, she said, I think that's a foolish idea. She let me know that she would not be very happy with that idea at all, so I didn't.
Now, based on your military experiences in the field of intelligence, how valuable do you believe your role in the conduct of the war in Vietnam was to the overall war effort?
I can't see much that we did that was terribly useful to the people of Vietnam. I almost hate to say that, but what they were doing in country, in dealing with, the unit movements, in country, was a whole lot more, important than what we were doing, in Hawaii. I think what we were doing in the remainder of the Pacific was more valuable to the overall military effort in the Pacific than what we were doing was valuable to the war fighting effort in Vietnam. I think what they were doing, the close work that was being done in Vietnam was much more valuable.
So you had your eyes 20 years ahead of the Vietnam War? You're just trying to determine the political makeup of the Pacific?
No, not 20 years. Not 20 years. Again, having said earlier that, that I think we, quote, won the Vietnam War because of the way the Pacific is functioning today, yeah, that was the hope. But really what the military was doing, on an annual basis or a day-to-day basis was just trying to keep things, calm and, under control for that period of time. And we'd let the State Department and the policy setters worry about 20 years from now. We just had to worry about, like the Watch Committee, what's going to happen in 30 days, what's going to happen in 6 months. things of that proximity.
So, what were your responsibilities? Could you go by year and rank for what you did as an intelligence officer? So, as a second lieutenant, what?
Hardly any difference at all. And I've thought of that a couple of times too. In other situations, the infantry is the classic. As an infantry second lieutenant, you get responsibility for 30 people. As an infantry first lieutenant, you get responsibility for a few more. An infantry captain, you get responsibility for 150 people. And you can see, your responsibility
Concrete difference.
going up from a platoon leader, to a company XO, to a company commander, and then, up from that, a battalion commander, and by the time you get to be a colonel, if you're in the infantry, you hope to get a, command of a division. Lucky you, But what I did on day one, of my job was no different than I did on the day I left Hawaii. I mean, was it a year? Almost a year before I got to Hawaii. I was in Georgia for 2.5 months, Baltimore for a couple of months, Fort Meade for 3 or 4 months. I left Fort Meade, I think, in April of '66. So I got to Hawaii April or May of '66 and left there in June of '68. The day I got on the island, I didn't do anything different. I never commanded a troop. I was a standalone, analyst. I analyzed what they told me to look at. I, read the traffic they told me to look at, write what I thought was interesting. I got a little more responsibility as I came along. Like, I wouldn't have been offered the watch officer, the assistant watch officer job on day one. I wouldn't have been writing the morning briefings on day one. But again, no troop assignments ever. And maybe you can say my level of responsibility for writing got increased as I spent time at it. But the job was really the same.
So, besides the weekends, would you ever receive any furlough time from duty?
We took one vacation. For a week, we went to an Army camp on the Big Island of Hawaii, up on the volcano. There was the Army had a facility up there that we could spend time there for very little money. It's like $8 a day, I think. It was Spartan. There were cabins and kind of a common dining room. It was like going to camp, with other folks. And I, took the kids and the family. And we saw the volcano. Volcano was spitting lava at the time. It was very exciting. Good tours. That was fun. And then we went to a hotel on Maui. Having the money that we saved at the camp on the Big Island, we splurged at a hotel on Maui. And that was fun. That was fun. We saw Lahaina, the whaling capital of the Hawaiian Islands in the 1850s. Coming from Connecticut and having visited the Mystic Seaport with my then wife while we were at Yukon, it was very interesting to see Lahaina. It was like you picked up Mystic Seaport and transported it to an island in the Pacific and dropped it down. It was that dramatic. Now, you couldn't see it in Honolulu. Honolulu was, a modern city that covered, the whaling, history. But Lahaina, and that's where they were. They spent the winter in Lahaina because it was too cold, in the northern Pacific. They would come into the warmer waters of Lahaina and spend the winter. Just like Mystic Seaport. Just like Mystic Seaport. And if you'd read the names of the people that moved there, they were all from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. It made us feel at home, I guess, to a degree. That was fun. That was the only vacation we took. There were a lot of our friends married without children, they would take space available junkets to Thailand, Taipei, Japan, the Philippines. It was cheap to fly. You just go down to Hickam, and sign up. Where's there a plane going with 2 empty seats, and they'd go. It's kind of hard to do that with 2 very young children. So we didn't take any of those trips. But the trip to the other islands in Hawaii was the one trip we did take.
So how valuable do you feel the intelligence gathering role in the United States military is to the success of wars or kind of campaigns or battles?
I think it's very important. I think it's crucially important at literally every level. If you think about the lowest level, where a guy might get killed, it's absolutely critical that maybe not he, but that the commander at that lowest level know what's out there, know what the threat is, know whether he should turn around and run away or whether he should proceed. You don't want to walk into a buzzsaw or an ambush and get your people killed. You want to know who's on the other side of the hill. Crucially important. Almost goes without saying. And as you move up the line, I don't think it gets any less important. It's somewhat more removed from the immediacy of the frontline combat, and you don't need any better example than, I hate to get into current politics, but the last combat troops are out of Iraq as of yesterday. Thank God. They never should have been there in the first place. And I knew, as well as I know my own name, that the apologists for that war were going to blame it on bad intelligence, and they do. It was not bad intelligence, it was bad policy. The good intelligence was there to be read, interpreted, and listened to, and it was ignored. I'm not sure how you phrase that exactly, but we got into the Iraq War for failing to follow good intelligence. There actually was no bad intelligence, because what there was they manufactured. It was purely manufactured. It was bogus. It was bogus material. There was no intelligence that provided any rationale for the Iraq War, the Second Gulf War. The intelligence on the Afghan War in the beginning was actually pretty good. It was actually quite good. We had people running around Afghanistan on horseback with these tribesmen who live on horseback. I've seen photographs of them. They were out there with them collecting, and that's what they were there for. They were funny. They see these guys riding around on these horses. They were intelligence collectors. They collected it. They had it. They knew, where the bad guys were. They knew where Osama bin Laden was in Tora Bora. They had the intelligence that pinpointed where he was, and decisions made at a very high level said, we're not going there. We'll be debating that decision for a long time. But the intelligence was good. Intelligence was good. Anybody will tell you. Intelligence is crucial. Everything's crucial in war. You can't do anything badly and expect to win a war. One of the things we were talking about very early on, you and I, was logistics. Logistics is not a very sexy topic, but you can't run a war without logistics either. Patton can't chase, the Germans, back to Berlin without gasoline.
Clean socks.
And clean socks.
That was Patton's big thing. Everybody had to have
Everybody had clean socks. My father would tell you that one of the things after gasoline and ammunition, he wanted maps. And if you think of it, you don't want to make a wrong turn. You know, if you're driving a column of tanks, it's hard to turn those boys around. Maps are important.
Right.
Everything's important, in war. And when you're the United States, you better do it better than anybody else. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to contribute to the interview?
No, except to thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ladwig, for your military service. I
Well,
appreciate it very much.
I will add one more thing.
Here we are.
You asked me if I was ever given a hard time. No, I was never given a hard time. And no, I didn't join, the units, the local veterans organizations that would march in parades. I didn't do that. But one other person had said what you just said to me. Although she mouthed it. I was at a rodeo in Texas, and it was a military night at the rodeo. If you were in the Navy, you stood up when they played the Navy song. If you were in the Army, you stood up when they played the Army song. So I stood up, and a woman turned around to me and she said, "You." Thank you.
No, we really appreciate what everybody in your generation did over there. And like we said, like we agree, the reason the Pacific looks the way it does.
I firmly believe it. I think it does almost speak for itself. I read recently a novel of combat in Vietnam, and not having seen it myself, the best I can do. I've never watched any Vietnam War movies. I haven't seen one or heard of one, but I wanted to see. I have read several, memoirs and a few novels. Jim Webb has written a couple of novels that I like a lot. Well, the most recent one that I've read is called Matterhorn, and it is a tough read. I mean, what it was like as this was a Marine company, but six of one, half a dozen if it was Marines or Army infantry. It was really, really hard, miserable, hard. Legs were lost, arms were lost, eyes were lost, lives were lost. It was miserable, miserable stuff. And yet, I'm glad they did it. Very hard to look at square in the face. Very, very hard. Very, very messy. But I'm really glad they did it. And I take some comfort. You don't read an awful lot of support or apologies for the war. Even politicians who were in the war seem to have run away from it. But there's a military writer, a British military writer, John Keegan, and he has written, I wish he'd write more on Vietnam. I'd love to read John Keegan on Vietnam because he's so perceptive, in my opinion. But in commenting on Vietnam, his comment was very succinct. It was a war that had to be fought. And I subscribe to that.
Well, thank you again for you and all the other boys
And thank you.
who were over there.
I've enjoyed the conversation with you.
And I'm floored to have it added to our archives.
Good. Me too. For whatever it's worth, I'm glad to be there too.
Thank you, sir.